Hi guys, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host Indira, and today I'm joined by three of the leading ladies within the area of Reds. Renee McGregor, Melissa Lodge and Pippa Woolven. Between them, these three ladies hold a huge range of experience and expertise. Renee's got over 20 years of experience working as a dietitian and has worked closely with elite athletes and in particular specialises around all things nutrition, Reds and female athlete health. Melissa Lodge is a researcher who's actively a PhD candidate. She's a graduate research and teaching assistant, dietetic student, and elite runner herself. Her research focuses mainly around female athlete physiology, particularly that of those in a state of Reds. Pippa Woolven is the founder and director of Project Red S, which works to increase awareness and prevention and support for Reds. She uses her own experience and her qualification as a behavioural change coach to help and mentor athletes. Between the three of them, we've got a range of angles and perspectives, and in this episode, these three angles are brought together to pull back the layers on Reds, what it really is, what it really means to have it, and what it really means to recover from it. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in all their questions. It was great to see so much engagement and interest in this episode. It wasn't possible to cover all the questions as so many were sent in. However, we did structure the conversation in a way which aimed to cover the content and meaning behind most of these questions. But all three ladies have said they would be up for doing a future podcast episode, so we will get around to covering some of the areas that we didn't manage to cover in this episode. And finally, in the interest of time, I kept the introductions to these amazing women pretty short, but be sure to check out the description down below to find out a little bit more about what they've done and what they do. As always, please be sure to give a rating to the show if you've been enjoying it. It really helps give credibility to the podcast so I can keep bringing you guys the guests you want to hear from. Okay, let's do this. Hi guys, so today I'm joined by three of the most, key ladies in the area of sort of Red S, research, recovery. I've got Renee McGregor, I've got Pippa Woolven, I've got Melissa Lodge. Melissa Lodge from FED or Fed Collaborative, Pippa from Project Red S, and Renee from Renee McGregor Nutrition. And so today we're going to go through kind of a little bit more about what to do after Red S, what happens next once you know you've got Red S, once you know what Red S is. And then also we're going to answer the questions you guys sent in, loads of really, really great questions. So thank you for everyone who sent them in. And so first things first, if we just go round and kind of give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. So let's start off with Melissa. Can you introduce yourself, your expertise and your kind of professional connection to the area of Red S?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I run the Fed Collaborative Instagram account, which was really a way and an effort for me to translate some of what I was reading in the research to maybe more common language. I'm a third-year PhD candidate, graduate teaching and research assistant and dietetic student, studying primarily female athlete physiology. And I specifically focus on conditions of low energy availability, such as relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS, which we'll be talking a lot about today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And Renee, can you introduce yourself and your professional connection to the area?
Sure. I'm Renee McGregor. I'm a sports dietitian and author, and I've been working in the field of REDS and eating disorders for over 20 years. I was a clinical dietitian first, working in eating disorders. Saw a lot of commonality when I moved into sport around low energy availability and the overlap between some of the symptoms that we see. I also work with numerous different sporting organisations, and I'm the nutrition lead for English National Ballet and Scottish National Ballet, and we recently contributed to the consensus statement on how to manage REDS in dance in particular. So I work in it day in, day out, so it's very much my bread and butter. So yeah, looking forward to seeing where the conversation goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And Pippa, can you introduce yourself and your professional connection to the area?
Sure. I'm Pippa Woolven. I'm a former GB steeplechase and cross-country runner, and I'm the founder of Project Red S. I started this in 2021 during lockdown when I had previously suffered from the condition and had noticed that there was a lack of more general information explaining this in a sort of layman's terms, in an easy to digest, understandable way. And I felt compelled to share my story and share the story of other athletes who had been through it, providing some peer support and also signposting towards clinical specialists in the area, which are kind of hard to come by unless you're in the know.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we've got a great spread of amazing women here today. We've got some with a lot of experience and expertise in the area of kind of diet nutrition, and we've got someone with some lived experience and someone who's actively researching in the field. So I think we've got a very, very suitable panel here today. And so if we start off with a couple of things to maybe just dive into RED-S and what's current and what's topical. Rini, if you'd like to start off, are there any trends you've noticed recently in terms of how people are coming to you, what they're asking for, what their main concerns around RED-S seem to be at the moment?
I mean, there's a real mix of symptoms. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully will come out as Melissa talks as well about the research, is that we're seeing so many more systematic problems as a result of RED-S. Now, I think there's a question later around kind of, does RED-S actually exist? And I think it's more about, is the terminology right? Should we be calling it RED-S rather than does it exist? We 100% know that this condition exists and understand that it's obviously underpinned by low energy availability. But I suppose what I'm seeing quite a lot of in clinic more and more, and actually, being referred into by lots of sports medics and cycling teams and other professional teams, is more around the lack of rest. So like the kind of high training load and the lack of kind of recovery, should we say? And I'm not just talking about nutritional recovery, I'm talking about physical recovery and how that is having a big impact. And I think we're seeing that more in everyday athletes, in the sense that we've got everyday athletes who are observing professional athletes and wanting to be training in the same capacity, but they're also holding down full-time jobs. Some of them also have families. And so, they're getting up earlier and earlier to train, or they're going to give themselves less and less time to recover. And I think these are then kind of presenting and manifesting as quite interesting symptoms, including, so you've got the common ones around, especially in female health, around menstrual cycle, but actually the most common ones I've seen recently have been sort of neurological problems, so in terms of nerve damage and the kind of long-term consequences of that, lots of autoimmune type conditions, and also the most common one is actually now around sort of the sort of like myocarditis and the COVID link as well, which is really, really interesting. So there's a lot more going on this issue than I think people assume. I think it's still very much presented as, you need to eat more and do less, which is definitely part of the puzzle, but it is one piece of the puzzle. It's a lot more complicated. And like I said, I'm interested to hear what Melissa's seeing in the research as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear. And, those are definitely three areas that I personally haven't seen bumping around very much. And so definitely something to dive into a little bit deeper later on. And I guess it makes sense if we sort of move on to you now, Melissa, in terms of the research. Are there any new trends or new things that seem to be bumping around the world of academia?
Yeah, I think from more of the RED-S perspective on the research side of things, research tends to lag behind practical application, or maybe what we're seeing athletes do. So I guess my trends might seem a little bit more behind, but from what I'm seeing is like this demonization around carbohydrates and sugar has started to pick up steam on the research side of things, especially from the RED-S lens. We're seeing a majority of that energy is actually coming from a lack of intake of carbohydrate. And so we really need to parse out what's going on there. First of all, why is that happening? And what can we do to prevent that? And then secondarily, what symptoms or signs might be exacerbated by that? And is it truly a lack of energy, or is it a misdistribution of the macronutrients? So that's something that I'm seeing a lot more, and I think is being mirrored still in the social media world around like sports nutrition products or beverages, and this idea that we're like taking sugar out of things that inherently is meant to have it. And so I'm like kind of bopping around like though kind of trying to balance those two things because we know that it's meant to be there for a reason. And so I hope that the research can start to encourage people to engage in those behaviors more healthfully because there's a reason why those macronutrients were in those products to begin with. And then I do think that there's also similarly been a trend towards fasting or trying to navigate this idea around fitting everything in and what that means, not just from like a nutrition recovery standpoint, but what if you work out early in the morning and you don't have time necessarily to get in calories before training, and what impact that can really have. So I think from the red side of things, we're trying to get a little bit more nuanced from the research lens. We have a lot of cross-sectional work. We have a lot of work that's shown these negative outcomes from a baseline low energy availability perspective. Now, what does that low energy availability look like throughout the day? And what does that look like from a macronutrient distribution standpoint? I think that that's kind of where I see most of the work going. And also some of that's hopeful on my end that I think we need more of that. And sometimes I'm left to say, oh, well, we don't really know at the moment, or there's a lot of pushback because we see it in practice and we don't quite have the research to back up everything that clinicians are seeing yet. But I think that relationship is being exposed. And so we need to spend more time and resource investigating that.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. There's a lot there to think about. And definitely, I think it really highlights the level of complexity of the condition and how much we still don't know, and why maybe it is something that's so difficult to still navigate when, the research isn't necessarily caught up with kind of the reality yet. And I guess on that note, as RED-S is sort of booming in recent years and more people seem to be struggling with it, Pippa, from your point of view, have you seen any changes in what people are approaching you looking for and how people are maybe searching for certain supports differently?
Yeah, I suppose when people email into Project RED-S, they are from such a diverse range of backgrounds. You could have a male Paralympic cyclist, you could have a recreational mid-50-year-old runner. And I think it's quite surprising, or it has been to me over the years, to see how many people this does impact. And quite often people are looking for free support with this because it's very costly to see private specialists, and we just don't have enough understanding or awareness within general medical practice, not through any fault of GPs themselves, but just through a lack of the research trickling into this, the medical field. So yeah, quite often people are asking what blood tests they need in order to get diagnosed for REDS. They want to know who to go to for dietary guidance, who to go to for psychological support, depending on whether that's been a factor in their experience. So yeah, it's quite shocking and also quite disturbing, how many people from such a huge array of experiences in sport are suffering and not finding the right support that they need.
Yeah, no, definitely. And do any of you, I guess, open to you all here, think that RED-S is something that is increasing in its kind of prevalence within the population of not just elite athletes, but also more recreational athletes? Or do you think it's just something which we now have a terminology to, I guess, diagnose and label?
I think that's a difficult one to answer because I think there's a bit of both. I think absolutely this has been going on for years. You speak to professional athletes from even 15, 20 years ago, and you discuss with them their experience, and they'll talk about the recurrent stress fractures they were having, or some of the kind of symptoms they were experiencing, and you know that they went through REDS, but it was never given a term. Like, obviously at that point it was only very much the female athlete triad, so all the male athletes literally had nothing. They were completely ignored from that point of view. So I think 100% the work that like both the accounts here, like, Project Reds and Feds are doing is great because we're raising awareness, and the awareness is really, really key. But as Pippa says, one of the big areas of pushback I find is trying to educate general medicine. I do a lot of education to GPs and try and do a lot of education for coaches and things, but it's very, very hard. And so I think it's a tricky one. I think, and as as Melissa said, social media is a massive problem, and it's not just influencers and athletes putting all their kind of behaviors out that's problematic. It's actually all the other public health messaging that is also very, very problematic, because I think one of the things that so many individuals who end up having issues with low energy availability and RED-S is that they can't filter what information is relevant to them and what information is relevant to a different population. And I think, like as Melissa kind of alluded, this whole conversation around demonizing sugar and carbohydrates. I mean, my post today was all about let's stop demonizing sugar, because it's for people who are active, actually sometimes it's really important. It might be the exact fuel you need in that moment to recover, to fuel your training, to even be in your training. And I think so I think from my perspective, I think there's a bit of both. Prevalence probably is increasing. It's hard to measure, but is it increasing because of societal pressures? Yes, just like eating disorders have continually to increase because of societal pressures and expectations. But also, I think the awareness that so many great accounts are doing, people are more, people now come in and to me and say, I think I've got RED-S. Whereas 5 years ago, they'll say, oh, I'm not really sure what's going on, but I think I've got a problem with food, or I think I've got, so the terminology is definitely changing from my perspective.
Yeah, same here.
Agree. I would echo everything that you had to say there. I've noticed myself too, just thinking about how athletes might go into a clinician's office suspecting that this is what they're struggling with. I think that is informative in a lot of ways, and you can start to advocate for yourself as an athlete. But I would highlight that from where the research is leading, it seems to be more of a spectrum, and different athletes' body systems may be affected differently. And so I think that there is this level of awareness that's hasn't quite been translated into complete understanding or knowledge from a lot of different people, like clinicians, GPs, athletes, where they're looking for like this one red herring, and they want to say like Pippa said, what blood test do I need? And there are blood panels that you can get that can provide very informative information about risk factors or warning signs or signs and symptoms, but it's way more complicated than that. And so that's where I think some athletes can get in their own way, in a sense of like they start to actually panic and hit the alarm bells maybe before we even need to go there. And it's like these smaller adjustments that actually need to be made, like adding in a breakfast if there's somebody who works out early and hasn't had a meal right before their training session, or reaching for the sports drink during their training session. And without that, they're missing some of these key components. But I think by and large, when we talk about like the further end of the spectrum, I think that prevalence is very hard to study and identify properly, but I don't know if we have that much information to suggest that that has changed that dramatically over the past couple of years. And it's probably more of an increased awareness around some of these terms, athletes for good reason taking onus of their own healthcare and like asking the right questions. But I don't know if that actually means like everyone that has a stress fracture should be worked up for having risk for RED-S, but it doesn't mean that they do, right? There's plenty of athletes who have like some of these red flags that need to be addressed, but they might not actually be in a clinical state of RED-S, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I would add on that I think I think it's that combination of information that you gather and the clinical questioning is the biggest part. And I think, you know, from my experience, often when people end up coming to my clinic, they've previously maybe seen medics or GPs or even like gynecologists or whatever, and they've not been questioned clinically in a way that can then give that picture. You have to look at the full picture. And I think that's not a simple task, and that's not something that every single practitioner will ever have the skill set to do. And I think, you know, it's one of the kind of general conversations I have all the time, is that just because we know what REDS is theoretically from what's written in papers and textbooks, actually that doesn't necessarily mean that you can then understand the condition, because, as you know, as Pippa also alluded, like sometimes there's a psychological element to it which is much more complicated and creates a huge amount more challenge for the individual working in it. So I think like it is brilliant that people are becoming more and more aware, and like if you're having recurrent injuries, you're not ignoring it, or if your menstrual cycle has been affected, you're not ignoring it. Like this all need to be, you know, as an athlete, these are things that need to be investigated. But I don't think we all need to completely judge, like instantly go, you've got REDS. And I think that's quite, you know, like from our point of view, yes, we do a battery of blood tests that have been kind of confirmed as the tests you would do to exclude anything else, because that's also important, right? Like sometimes when a female presents with a no menstrual cycle, it's not because they've got hypothalamic amenorrhea. They may have a prolactinemia, they may have PCOS, they may have so many other things going on, and it's so important that we are careful. But that's the first step, and then it's all the clinical questioning and the understanding of training load, the understanding of nutritional intake, the understanding of nutritional timing, but also understanding of body composition and history of body composition. It's not just about what's going on in that moment. It's looking at the really big picture. When did this start? When did you notice? Like it's not, I think this, and I think that's where my frustration comes in, is that it's it's a very complicated area, and we still don't know enough about it. Like every week we're learning new things, and hence why we've got the updated IOC paper now. But again, I'm sure that'll be updated again in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. Like it's important that we understand it's definitely an emerging condition.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And it sounds like it's definitely something that's incredibly complex, and there's a lot more to it in terms of its presentation, its impacts, and potentially many different sort of subsections and sub presentations of the condition. And it's more than just a single thing that it's kind of currently talked about as, and something that's got a lot more, I guess, wider scope. And so I guess, yeah, that's something that we can talk a bit about later. Maybe there's kind of different strains of it in some respects. And I guess as well, before we kind of go through things in a bit more depth, at the moment, I know some of you have already expressed kind of or alluded to this perhaps, but what's your number one key concern in terms of RED-S in female athletes at present? And Pippa, do you want to start off?
Sure. I'd say the thing I hear the most is someone has a deregulated menstrual cycle, and they've noticed that there's been a change, and they go to a general practitioner or their doctor and they say, something's happened to my menstrual cycle, and the doctor will prescribe the contraceptive pill as a means to treat the missing period or irregular menstrual cycle, in inverted commas. And that then leads the athlete or the exercising individual to believe that they no longer have a problem with it. You know, that the contraceptive pill or any form of hormonal contraceptive will take away that problem. And it's really concerning, because that simply serves to put a piece of masking tape on the underlying issue and doesn't serve to treat it. So, you know, that's really frustrating to hear that in 2024 we're still experiencing these issues. And you know, again, it's not through the GP's fault, it's just a lack of education there. That's the main concern for me.
Yeah, definitely. That is something that, yeah, for sure. I guess these things that can mask the reality are definitely very dangerous. And yeah, Rini, do you want to share your main concern at the moment?
Yeah, and I think it's similar to Pippa's. Like I think from a female health point of view, regardless of whether they've, like you said, whether they've got amenorrhea, whether they've got PCOS, it just appears that as soon as you have a problem with your hormonal health, we'll just shove you on the pill. Like that seems to be the general answer to everything. And yet, we're seeing more and more emerging studies about actually how the pill can actually be contraindicative, particularly in terms of bone health, if you are in low energy availability. So, if you put that you put that female on the pill and you've got your period back, because that, like, often I'm still hearing women who come into clinic and I say, well, tell me about your menstrual cycle. Oh yeah, I have a regular cycle. And I'm like, okay, but is that your cycle? Oh no, I'm on the pill. Well, I said, that's not your cycle. That's a withdrawal bleed. Actually, we don't actually understand what is going on with your cycle until we either take you off it, or we have to look at other markers and try and understand. So I think that's a really big thing, like the education around female anatomy and female hormonal health is, I think, something we need to be pushing through schools as well, and getting young women, as young girls, to understand what's normal, what's not normal, and not causing so much fear. Like, again, when I have young athletes, they're often relieved when they don't have a period, because it's annoying and it's inconvenient, and it's like, and actually we have to get them to understand that menstrual cycles are a barometer of health, not just in an indicative of that you've got enough energy in your system, but they're also supporting your bone health, and it's also supporting your cognitive health, and it's supporting your kind of brain development. Like, there's so much to the menstrual cycle beyond just being a bleed that you get every month. So I think that's probably one of my biggest concerns. And I think the other concern is around just the things we just don't know. Like, again, I've seen a lot of interesting and unusual symptoms that absolutely, like, in my opinion, have been related to behaviors around food and training. And I've then referred on to a sports medic, and they have confirmed that actually this is definitely a sign of red. So it's not me diagnosing it, but it's, I kind of think you get an inkling and you start picking things up. So I just think we have to be very, very mindful that it can present in more ways than just not having a period for females as well. And like digestive health is another really big one that we see in our clinic that often gets affected, and people just get told they've got IBS and then put on an exclusion diet, which makes the whole situation a lot worse. So I mean, there's lots of different things, but I guess they're the two main ones from my point of view.
Yeah, and just adding to that anecdotally, I think people are often looking for stress fractures or a missing period as the most obvious sign of this. But even in my experience, I was experiencing a really extreme form of fatigue. And every time I tried to run or train, I would just feel as though I was pushing against a brick wall. And because I wasn't experiencing stress fractures at that point in time, I couldn't believe it was something that could be related to an energy issue, even though it was really quite chronic and extreme fatigue. So I think not just assuming it's any of the main big red flags, but actually there are lots of other things that could be exacerbated as well, or instead of.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear. And it definitely seems like we do need to talk a bit more around the different ways that it can present. And potentially it seems as well that once one thing goes, there's almost a bit of a snowball effect in terms of how it impacts on overall health in general. And Melissa, do you have anything in addition you want to add?
Yeah, I think they covered some of my main concerns as well. But one thing that's been top of mind recently, as I'm kind of aging in the sport myself, is I have teammates or friends, peers that are starting to think more long-term about their health. And it's a very difficult thing to consider when you're younger, that these long-term consequences are worth considering in lieu of your short-term success. And so I think it's very complicated to convey that you're going to make the sacrifice and it could be too late. And you don't quite realize that. It's like, unfortunately, like, I know some of my peers have gone through this at later stages in their career. But how do we get that message across to a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old who has the capability to do some things about these long-term consequences at that age? And I'll just use myself as an example. Like, you could not have convinced me to care when I was 15 about what I will be when I'm 75. And now I'm starting to put those pieces together. I'm like, I really wish I cared, but how do we then get those kids to care? Because it's very hard to see it when you're so far away from it. And I just like that's something that's been weighing on my mind just from a interpersonal standpoint, but also from a research lens is like we actually don't have enough information about the long-term consequences in general, but the ones that we do have input on, like bone health, is something that we lay the foundation for well beyond where we'll actually experience some of those really severe and really long-term consequences. So I just hope that we can find ways to close those gaps because it is kind of scary when you think about some of the sacrifices that are made and you don't really realize until it could potentially be too late.
Yeah, that's a really
I think
interesting.
Sorry.
No, go.
Oh, no, the other thing I was going to just add to that, because I think it sort of plays into it, is I think people not appreciating how long it takes to recover from RED-S as well. I think there's this misconception that particularly if, let's say, your menstrual cycle is your main symptom, as soon as you get that back, your body's going to be like ping back to health. And it's not as simple as that. Like, you know, depending on how long you've been in low energy availability or you've been under that stress that is causing the symptoms that are presenting, it can take 18 months, it can take 2 years, it can take longer. And I think, and again, we don't know, but I think that's one of the things I find quite frustrating from a social media point of view are individuals that are discussing their recovery on, you know, their journey on social media, and they'll say, oh, look, I'm recovered now. It's been 6 weeks and I've got my period back. And I'm like, and it's hard because then you're working with individuals who are stuck, you know, or their bodies are taking longer to recover from for whatever reason. And as you know, as Melissa said, everybody's physiology is slightly different and how we respond is different. And you can't put a time frame. The question I get asked all the time is how long? How long until I get my period? How long until I can run again? How long until I can? And the answer is it depends. And I don't have that answer, and nobody wants to hear that because it's not very comfortable. You know, that kind of feeds into that psychology of not knowing and then believing. And I think it is very tricky to give people that response. And I think the other thing I'd say is that also how long it takes to get into that position of RED-S is also very variable. Some individuals will fall into it very, very quickly for whatever reason, maybe the extreme to what they're doing. And other people, it will take potentially years before it starts to present. Like, you know, it's happening. You can, I mean, I can see it a mile off when I'm looking at certain athletes and accounts. I'm like, okay, I predict that in 18 months' time, if they don't change, they're going to probably present with some sort of stress fracture or something. You can, you know, when you're working in it, you can see it. But it's hard because I think some people do get away with it for a lot longer. And I use that terminology. And as Melissa said, if you're getting away with it, why would you change it? If you're getting the results, and that's the complexity of RED-S, right? Is that for a short period of time, and that will again vary from individual to individual, but for a short period of time, you actually see performance benefits, not negatives. And so then people get stuck. And I have so many athletes, very high level professional athletes who have been in RED-S for a very long time, but performed at a high level for a very long time during that. And the difficulty in helping them get back to their health is that they're constantly comparing themselves to when they were in that space and performing well and going, but when I was X, when I was eating like this, that's when I got my best results. And it's like, yeah, but it wasn't sustainable. And it's that's hard to deliver. It's hard to get people to understand that your body might maintain it for a really short period of time, but it's not sustainable. And I think Melissa's right. How we communicate that, particularly to younger athletes, is really important if we want to prevent a higher increase of people ending up with RED-S.
I think that I'll just jump on to say that some of the complexity around like when these things come online, I know it can feel quite frustrating. And like you mentioned, Renee, it's like they want the answer and sometimes we don't have it. But the IOC recently in the 2020, oh my gosh, that isn't so recent anymore. It's like been a year. But anyway, in the 2023 consensus, they had proposed this idea around an accumulated dose of low energy availability. And I think that this is something that clinicians and researchers should really keep in mind while researching these outcomes. Because I think that this is why sometimes the answer depends. And you alluded to it, the magnitude. So, what is the actual energy availability status and how far below that norm is an athlete? How long have they been exposed to low energy availability? Has it been weeks? Has it been years? The longer that you're in that state, the harder it's going to be, or the longer it might take to reverse some of those consequences, and the harder it may be to reverse some of the long-term effects, and the frequency. So maybe you have an athlete who is exposed to these periods of low energy availability, but they don't stay there year round. That still might have an effect. And so that can really play into some of the reasons why we are often having to say it depends, let alone that people's body systems may respond differently to some of the effects. And then also the origin. Some of the research has started to look at whether or not it matters if the low energy availability comes from a decrease in energy intake or an increase in exercise energy expenditure, or a combination of those things. And so we're dealing with a lot of puzzle pieces. And I, as an athlete, do understand how that can be frustrating to sit on the other side of it and hear like, oh, there's still a lot we don't know. But I just want to shed light on some of the reasons about why that is. And like that some people think like, oh, well, they're just saying that it could be low energy availability, but they're always saying like, we don't know why, or like it could affect this and maybe that, and we don't have the answer. And I just want to kind of bring attention to the fact that of why that is, and like why we do need a lot more work in this field and a lot more research to support some of what we're seeing clinically, because we do know that athletes are facing these challenges and that they're presenting with certain issues, and that this could be an underlying cause. But there's a lot of different ways that it can present.
And just to add to that, I think, Rini, you've highlighted this in the past, but physical recovery doesn't always equate to psychological recovery. And I think what everybody has to keep in mind, coaches, parents, athletes, is that perhaps the longer you've been in a state of low energy availability or started to believe certain falsehoods about the way you should train or the way you should eat, that can become quite hardwired. And, it can be very difficult to reverse those psychological patterns when in recovery. And even actually, if physically you might be eating enough to regain some of your biological functions, psychologically, you could always be held back by the beliefs that you've not quite left behind, or the patterns that you find yourself falling into. And that can take decades for some people to drop completely, if ever. And, that's really quite a huge thing to be carrying your whole life, not just in your athletic life, but in your daily existence, as well as a consequence of this condition. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that this can impact your entire existence, not just your physical health.
Yeah, I think as Pippa has sort of brought to the attention, it's a huge part in the again, going back to the piece of the puzzle, understanding your personality. Like there is a definite certain type of personality that's going to be much more affected. I'm not saying it's always the case, but they're definitely going to be much more affected. And if you definitely need to do the work in understanding who you are and how you respond, and also especially when there's like more eating disordered eating aspects related to RED-S, is appreciating what the purpose of those behaviors are. Like why do you restrict your energy intake when you intellectually understand that it's probably not helping you? It's being able to appreciate that often it's a coping mechanism that you have learned. Often eating disorders, they're not conscious. They're one of those kind of conditions that occur because an individual is going through an intense period of, I like to call it chaos, where life feels very difficult and unbearable for whatever reason whether that's loss or trauma or stress or just kind of this constant noise in their head about who they are and how they perceive themselves, which is all related to your experiences and interpretations of the world around you, right? It's complicated. And the kind of disordered eating behavior is something that almost you fall upon as a way of feeling okay for a short period of time. So whether that's excessive training or restrictive eating or binge eating or, whatever it might be, all these behaviors, they're not people who like are fearful of food as such, but they use food as a way of trying to make themselves feel okay. But unfortunately, it's a temporary thing. And then you get caught up, as Pippa was saying, you get caught up in behaviors that become very ingrained and then have biological consequences. So it's a lot more, again, we go back to, it's a much more complicated scenario than I think people first alluded to. And I think also we have to be very mindful that, I think Melissa said at the beginning, there's like this spectrum of REDs, and we know that you can have like unintentional REDs, which is definitely much easier to kind of work with because there's less psychological association with it, and then it can obviously become much more complicated when you get disordered eating disorders, exercise dependency, and it's being able to work out what is going on for that person, and how do you support that person, what do they need first. That's always one of the big things, is when I've got someone who comes in with a comorbidity of exercise dependence and restrictive eating, what do I work with first? Because, both are their coping mechanisms. And if I take away both, then they flail, right? That's not how it works. You have to be able to build up that trust and that understanding and give them the understanding of why they do what they do, and then try and understand, well, actually, in this case, although I'm not maybe comfortable with them doing as much training exercise as they're doing, it's probably better to maintain that and to work on the nutrition. And other times it's let's work on the exercise side of it, and then leave the nutrition as it is. You can't do it all. And again, that can be very frustrating for the person who is looking for support, because, well, I want to be fixed yesterday. And it's not as simple as that. And I think that's the bit that again often gets overlooked in the recovery aspect of it.
And on that note, when it comes to recovery, I mean, I guess everything starts with, like you've all mentioned, the understanding the why, the reasons behind something happens. There's a lot of people who will know that they're in a state of REDS or have started a process of trying to recover from it, but don't seem able to fully commit to or sustain the habits required to remove themselves from the state of REDS. But as you mentioned before, there being certain types of personalities. These are people who've got the ability to almost have extreme self-discipline to the point where it's in these respects unhealthy. How is it that when they know or they have the knowledge that this is bad for their body, that this won't give them that long-term success, why is it so difficult for them to shift those habits and that approach towards recovery? What are kind of the key barriers going on there, and why do you think people have this such strong fear of letting go of exercise or food in particular, of all the kind of coping mechanisms there are out there?
Such a good question. I think just from my perspective, it completely varies on the individual, of course, but I personally feel that having a strong support system around you can make all the difference in that regard. If you're living, eating, sleeping, breathing, your training, and that isn't a necessarily healthy environment for you, then it can be very difficult to make any kind of behavior change. But if you're able to remove yourself from that setting and surround yourself with positive influences, it can certainly be much easier. So I think it's completely varies, of course, but it's hard to change certain behavioral patterns if you're remaining in the environment that perpetuated them in the first place.
Yeah, I smiled when you asked that question because it felt like if I had the answer, I would solve all of the world's problems or all of the female athletes' problems. So I do think it's super complex. And there's a lot of great discussion around those psychological factors. And so I would just echo those, but I think like Pippa said, the social environment, the sport specific pressures, they all kind of compound. So different sporting cultures really can perpetuate some of these ideas, whether it's about fueling or exercise or body composition. And I think it can be really hard when you're working on the psychological factors that underpin your own behaviors and thoughts, that might still be in and around your environment. If you have an athlete with RED-S who's trying to recover, but they're surrounded by teammates, and there's a lot of peer comparison that goes on across all of these factors as well. And so those can be really supportive environments, like Pippa alluded to, like these types of environments can bring people out of these things, but they can also perpetuate and make it difficult for an athlete to remove themselves from these situations. But then on top of that, there's the supportive environment. There's clinicians working with the individual, and it can still be very difficult to work out of a state of RED-S. I think some of it is just, it's not as cut and dry. Like athletes are, like you said, committed. They can focus very intently on one goal. That's what has made them a very successful athlete, but that's also what's made them successful at maybe this disorder in a sense as well. And so I think, again, if I had the exact answer, we would solve a lot more problems. But I think some of it is this redirection towards a different goal. And if you can really shift an athlete's mindset towards that performance goal that they so desperately want in the first place, that's typically what's driven them to a state of control around their body, around food, around exercise. They've fallen into these patterns sometimes in order to be a good athlete. And so it's going to take a lot to redirect it, but to try to convince them that the thing that they are doing is actually holding them back from that performance can be a really good carrot. It's kind of like a motivator for them. And I've seen this in my own life and in my teammates who have had some success removing themselves from these situations. Is unfortunately we see some athletes drop out. They leave the sport altogether. They might just like end up in a perpetual injury cycle. And the ones who have turned a corner, in a sense, I think I've seen a lot of common thread to this ideal performance. And if you can direct their focus towards that and say, okay, there's definitely these underlying like behaviors and thoughts that are going to be important to address. But if you can almost like mind over matter it and say like, you're going to fuel because that's going to help your performance. If you can get them there, then you can still continue to work on those like underlying behaviors as a result. But I think that that's like an important place to start. And then like all of the great work that I think everyone on this call is committed to doing is working on the societal, the social, the sport-specific pressures that arise, and how can we educate the general practitioners? How can we educate the coaches? How can we make sport a safer place to allow athletes to do the things that they so desperately want to do, like perform, but also maintain their health in pursuit of that performance?
Definitely.
I think something that often gets missed in recovery is that athletes, these individuals, I'm going to say individuals because it's not always professional athletes, it can be, everyday individuals who exercise a lot as well, is they're usually highly intelligent and they're incredibly aware of what they're doing and they know it's not good for them. So they intellectually understand it. And the biggest thing people say to me is, I know I shouldn't be doing this, so why am I doing it? And the reality is that there's often a somatic response that's going on. Right. And you have to work with that somatic response. So you can't think yourself better. You can, to a degree, that can help. You can alter your thinking to a certain degree, but if you can't alter the somatic response that's going on internally, then you're not going to be able to change your behavior. Because the somatic response, that belief, is that fear belief that's keeping you stuck. Whether that's a belief of, I need to be a certain weight in order to perform well, whether that's a belief of I'm only good enough if, like it could be related to so many things. A lot of the athletes I work with, before they became pros, before they became the level they had, they were, you start kind of exploring into their life as young athletes, and a lot of them have been known as the sporty one. That's their identity. That's how they got approval. So they'll often talk about, an academic sibling, or an attractive sibling, and they were the one that would this. So it's a way of seeking approval, and so these fear beliefs have literally been growing in them since they were younger, and they've just they're perpetuated by the environments we live in. So unless you start doing the somatic work, and that's why it's one of the reasons that I did additional training last year in terms of doing mindfulness and becoming a mindfulness practitioner, because it can be really helpful. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all. I'm not saying it's the only approach, but it can be really helpful to help the individual go internally and understand what is it that they are believing about themselves. Because if you are believing that you're not good enough, if you are believing that you're only going to be accepted if you can perform or achieve, no amount of thinking differently is going to change that belief system. So I think it is, the psychological aspect of this condition is complicated and is often built around fear. And as humans, we always want to try and feel okay. So all these behaviors we've learned to push hard, to eat in a certain way, to try and fit into our environments because that's what everybody else is doing, they're all just ways to try and make us feel like we belong. Because that's what humans want. They want to feel like they belong. And I think, if you don't feel like you belong, you will try and mold and put yourself into that. So I think that somatic aspect is really important to understand, and it's definitely not picked up in terms of the research at the moment at all. Like, I think the psychological bit is really missing when it comes to like the IOC paper. It's literally mentioned rather than actually investigated, and I think that's where we definitely need a bit more understanding.
Yeah, and I think the individuals themselves have not paused to consider the reasons behind their behaviours.
Yeah.
They're very intelligent, they're very driven, but they're typically quite busy, caught up in the thrill of training and competition. And the last thing they have considered in their recovery experience is, why do I feel the need to exercise before breakfast? Why do I not allow myself to eat a whole potato, that sort of thing? And actually, when I started mentoring other athletes, they would all ask, what did you do to recover? And I would tell them. And I quickly realized that wasn't doing them any good at all. Just telling someone what to do was not at all helpful. So I then did a master's in psychology coaching and behavior change coaching, which enabled me to question them on, why do you think you're doing this? And just giving someone the space to reflect on why they felt compelled to behave a certain way was completely game changing, because they started to realize that wasn't serving them well after all. And therefore, they had the clarity and the understanding behind why they needed to change that behavior.
That's really interesting. It definitely goes to show kind of what a key role the psychological and that side of things plays in something that maybe presents in such a physical respect, and why it is so important to really ask those questions and really be introspective and ask why. And I guess one thing that comes up quite frequently in terms of RED-S recovery, and this might be related more to those who end up in a state of RED-S due to disordered eating or eating related struggles, but it seems that there's a lot of fear around gaining weight and what that will do for performance. And it's interesting that that's kind of an area of so much fear when there are lots of things that can impact performance. But as it can lead to short-term gains going into a state of RED-S, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself, is it possible to gain weight back after RED-S and then fully perform at the same level you were when you were in a state of RED-S? Or I think that's the question that a lot of people are fearful to kind of ask.
I think firstly, it's important to acknowledge that not everybody will need to restore weight. Like, just because you're in low energy availability, it doesn't mean you lose weight. And I think that's, again, a massive misconception, and one that is often reasons why general medical practitioners will overlook the individual, because they'll be, you look okay, so it should be fine. And I think that's again, it's really important to highlight that. Like it's usually if there is a weight restoration element to it, it's because the individual has probably got an eating disorder with it, like there is a severe restrictive eating disorder. So again, that becomes much more complicated because it's not just as simple as, oh, if I put weight, I won't perform as well. That's just a part of that whole belief system. There's a much bigger issue going on. But in my experience and observation of working with athletes and helping them to restore energy availability, restore their weight restoration if it's needed, is that eventually, and I use that word, eventually, yes, performance can not only go back to where it was previously, but probably improve, but it's not quick. And I think that's what is often where people get stuck, because they don't realize that, when your body's in this place of recovery, it's in a place of transition, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of biological function that needs addressing and repairing. So just because, again, you might feel like, oh, I've got my period back, I'm now, I'm physical body composition that is higher than it was before, or whatever it might be, it's going to take time then, that the body needs that energy and the time to be able to utilize the signals of training to then finally have the energy to adapt and get better. So it's like you're starting from scratch almost. So I think that's where a lot of people probably become challenged, and often reason why they don't want to move forward, because that fear of how long it's going to take is just it feels too big. Yeah, that's kind of, I'm sure the others have got things they want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that needs to be challenged from a psychological perspective, why they feel that way in the first place. At any point, it's definitely going to be more of a function of the low energy availability or REDS that performance suffers than any body composition metric that we are going to collect. And so I think focusing on that it's certainly more important to focus on having adequate fuel rather than making their body look a certain way. The research shows that there's really no specific arbitrary cutoff that signals a performance advantage across a variety of sports. So I think if we can get rid of that messaging altogether, that this will really help athletes. And then it does become complex in the sense that there might be a weight that's more appropriate for one athlete than another, because we know that there's not just one weight that's necessary to perform or a cutoff that's appropriate. And we do actually see that some athletes that are in a state of low energy availability and REDS, they don't lose weight and they actually maintain or gain weight because their body's trying to adjust to this lack of energy that it's being provided. And our bodies are smart. I always try to reiterate that to people, that you're trying to manipulate your body, but your body's going to work as hard as it can to stay alive. It kind of goes into this state of like becoming thrifty, right? And so if you're not giving it enough, it's going to make the most of what you are providing to it. And so sometimes we see athletes that are suffering from low energy availability have a higher body weight than those who are fueling adequately. And so I think that that's a tricky message it's like a tricky line to walk, because I still don't want the emphasis to be on the body composition, but that can actually be motivating for some athletes, or at least reduce the barrier to recovery, that you say, well, actually, that might not be an experience that you have in the first place. And if you do actually have to regain some weight, or you end up at a higher weight after recovery than you did when you started, it's because your body needed to. And if your body needed to, then your body's going to support the training that you put in to perform at the level that is appropriate. And so that timeline does vary, right? So I will echo that that's definitely a barrier, because sometimes the body changes and the performance doesn't come immediately as a result. But I think that it's a very, as with everything that we've discussed today, it's a very complex topic and situation. And so I think just encouraging athletes, first and foremost, to challenge that belief, because I think that will go the furthest And then if you're working on challenging that belief through recovery, then your body will figure itself out. And if you allow it the adequate fuel and time to do so, then there's no reason to suggest that your performance is going to suffer because of the extra amount of weight or lack of weight that you were able to put on. I think that the focus should really be on the other outcomes that are a result of the low energy availability. And if you can address those and you can fuel adequately, that your performance should return, if not improve, from adequate fueling.
Pippa, do you have any kind of insights from your own personal experience in terms of that recovery process and how it impacted on your performance?
Well, I think, as the others have alluded to, it really depends on your motivation for displaying the behaviors that perhaps led to your low energy availability in the first place. If you're solely trying to improve your performance and you believe that the way to do that is to train harder and to eat less, then that's one thing. But if you intentionally restricted your calorie intake or your food groups to lose weight, or enhance your body composition in any way, then that's another thing. And that would be your motivator to recover, because perhaps you didn't achieve the goals that you set out to, and or you're told that by increasing your intake and reducing your expenditure, you might have favorable advantages to your body composition. But I think for a lot of people, certainly the people that I speak to, they are most interested in performance. And unfortunately, as Renee alluded to earlier, when you may have improved your performance temporarily through your experience of low energy availability, it can be very hard then to believe that you'll ever perform better at a different weight. So it's, again, just about challenging those assumptions and beliefs and trying to perhaps maybe even experiment a bit, give yourself permission to try something new, because what you're doing is no longer serving you well and will not ever serve you well in the long term. But it's very difficult. And personally, it took me years to get my head around the fact that I could perform better at a heavier weight, which is such a shame. But then again, back then, this was 10 years ago, we weren't having these conversations. And it was very hard to do that alone without support of your peer group or your family members who were educated about this. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, yeah, it's incredible to have kind of made that journey at that time, especially. And, it's great that you're able to then now bring that kind of learning forwards to help others around. And I guess to further on the point you talk about, Melissa, you touched on it, especially kind of our bodies being quite smart. Why do you think that people have so much fear around, I guess, trusting in their bodies? Or, Renee, you mentioned how a lot of these people are highly intelligent individuals. They know what they're doing. What do you think the barrier is that prevents people trusting their instincts naturally?
I think social media has a big part to play, if I'm brutally honest. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all, but I think we have lost the ability to listen to our internal cues. As Melissa said, our bodies know what they need to do. Like if you watch a toddler eat, a toddler will, when they're hungry, they will eat, and then when they're full, they will turn their face. They know that the body knows what to do. Similarly, when you're feeding a baby, it's the same sort of thing. And similarly, like if all goes to plan, the female body knows when that first period is going to happen. Like the human body knows what to do. We know how to give birth. We know how to do these things. But we are bombarded with information about eating in a certain way, training in a certain way, looking a certain way. And we have so much tech that constantly tells us that, this is how much you're eating, or this is how much you've expended. And none of it's accurate, because it can't be. Like, I even say to people, even when you're putting someone in a lab and you're testing them, that's in controlled conditions. That's not real life. you know, our bodies know what to do. That, you know, if it gets cold, we get hungry. You've probably noticed, because our body needs more energy to stay warm. You know, if we're tired, we probably notice we need a bit more energy because our brain needs a bit more sugar. Like, it's really important that if we start listening to our bodies, we'll actually self-regulate. And actually, again, as Melissa said, our bodies know what they want to do, and they know where they want to be as well. You know, everybody's body has a place it wants to be, and it works optimally for that person. And I'm not saying that means you can't, you know, you can't improve it if you're training and performing it, but you have to get to that point where it can actually optimally work for you, and then provide it with the information it needs, whether that's training signals and energy intake, that then will translate into particular performance benefits or body composition changes, depending on what, you know, what you're trying to do. So I think I'm not saying I don't want to blame everything on social media, although I wish I could most of the time. But I am obviously the oldest person here, and I had a life before social media, and I think it was a lot easier, if I'm honest. But I do think it contributes, because although we have access to all this information 24/7, our brains haven't caught up. So our brains can't filter all this information. It's just trying, and it keeps, or everything we see, we absorb, and we create little sound bites. So when we don't feel okay, you know, when that little niggly voice in us is telling us there's something wrong with us, we don't fit in, we're not good enough, we're not performing well enough, like, we then start looking for answers. And it's easy to think, and I say that it is easy to think, if I follow this, I will be better, rather than listening. I go back to that listening internally, and asking yourself, what is it you need right now? What is it you're believing? You know, I think it's really important so I think we have lost trust. And it's one of the things that I try and teach a lot of people I work with, to regain that trust in the body, and understand that it's working for you, not against you. And if you respect your body, they'll respond well. But if you don't respect it, if you don't nurture it, it's just going to rebel against you, because what else can it do?
Definitely. Yeah, some very wise advice there, and definitely stuff to take on board. And, you know, do keep that trust within your body. And to sort of move on to symptoms a little bit here now, I know, Rini, earlier you mentioned kind of some maybe less spoken about symptoms such as nerve damage, autoimmune, the link with COVID. It'd be great if you could expand upon that a little bit more. And then also if we could have a quick discussion around whether any of the symptoms of RED-S are perhaps more serious or more complicated than other symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like Melissa said, sometimes the research hasn't been done to back up what we see in clinical practice. And I think the more you're working clinical practice, the more you start to see things, and you sort of put two and two together and go, okay, actually, I've seen this now in like 100 people. And I need the kind of clinical, I need research to back it up. But there's definitely, I mean, we know that even if you look at the research around eating disorders, there is a link between individuals who have had an experience of an eating disorder, and then later on ending up with an autoimmune condition. We don't know why. We just know that there's a link, there's an association. It's to be related probably to, we'll probably find in another 5-10 years time, it's related to low energy availability, and how it has an impact on our immune system, and how our immune system responds. But it's a definite, you know, it's definitely something I'm seeing a lot of individuals with EBV, so Epstein-Barr virus, as a result of not recovering very well. So not, you know, obviously the low energy availability is in the mix there, but actually the biggest issue seems to be the lack of physical recovery. So you're doing, and again, I say probably more so in everyday athletes. Like, if you think about, go back to the extreme nature of everybody's doing more. You know, we're getting people doing more and more extreme events, and then even like the amount of time that they're leaving between competitive events is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Like, you know, as someone who works with a lot of people who do ultra running, people are not just doing one major race a year, or even two major, they're doing them every 2 months, every month, every 6 weeks, and they're not allowing their bodies to recover. And this is, again, a consequence of what we're seeing. So, you know, we will see a lot of, I see a lot, and one of the key symptoms of EBV is chronic fatigue. So it's related to chronic fatigue. And that's kind of one of the things that they'll go to their GP, and it's not the thing that they will manage. Nobody will look into that. Nobody will even do the test for that. But again, when you've started to see kind of the general kind of presentation again and again and again, you get good at going, okay, this looks like. So then it's a case of confirming it. And lo and behold, 9 out of 10 times when I've sent them to their GP with a letter to test BV, it's been positive. So, you know, it's so that we're definitely seeing a lot of. The nerve damage one is quite fascinating, and it's definitely, again, there's a more coming out from the eating disorder aspect, because again, more and more individuals who are restricting their eating and also have this comorbidity with exercise dependency, we're seeing that they're creating some very acute nerve damage that is sometimes not curable. So it goes back to just overstressing the nervous system, overstressing the body, and the body then not being able to always recover from that. So it is one of those things that's actually quite sad from a general perspective. Again, we're seeing more and more links with low estrogen and how that can start to affect your kidneys, particularly infecting, like causing more urinary tract infections, and then how that can then become more problematic if that's not like investigated and looked into. And I think this is, again, I know we've said this word I don't know how many times, but I think it is really complicated, because it's not just as simple as you're not eating enough, you're doing too much training, and you now need to reverse that. It's understanding that there's so many kind of knock-on effects of having low estrogen, or not having enough energy, or your nervous system being overstimulated because you're not recovering enough. Like it's that bigger picture that I hope we'll get more research to kind of confirm things, because it's definitely hard when you're working in clinical practice and there isn't the research to back it up, but you know that you need to do something to help these individuals. So you have to kind of go on experience and to support them in the best way possible.
I was going to call attention to the IOC REDS clinical assessment tool version 2 that came out in 2023, along with the consensus statement. It really aimed to provide more objective and criterion measures that we have seen in the research be associated with REDS. And similarly to the statements being updated, I would expect this clinical assessment tool to continue to progress as we learn more from clinicians and we start to confirm some of these outcomes from a research standpoint. But these clinical indicators have been grouped by like severe primary, secondary, and then what we call potential or emerging, where we actually do need a lot more researchers and clinicians reporting some of those outcomes to really decide maybe where they should rank in our list of indicators. And they have a calculator that's freely available online for clinicians to use, and is highly recommended that they use when doing a workup for REDS. So it includes like blood biomarkers, but it also includes things like menstrual cycle irregularities, psychological comorbidities, low bone mineral density. And then I think the question that you had to follow would be like those more severe or more concerning outcomes. And from my lens, when I came from the long-term consequence perspective, those are the ones that I kind of personally see as the ones that are of more concern, because they're harder to reverse in a sense, and they might have more long-term impact. And so from that standpoint, I think we really need to focus that conversation on bone health and the deviation from normal growth and development in the adolescent athlete population, because we're stunting their ability to lay down the foundation that we need in later life. And I think that there's a lot of good work that has been done in that space as a result, but I would just call attention to those outcomes specifically, because they take longer to get to that stage. So when we were talking about the exposure to low energy availability earlier, like it's going to take a longer or more severe case of low energy availability to get to a point where we're affecting bone or falling off our growth and trajectory curve. So then when we get there, there's very little time to reverse in some cases, and it can be too late in other cases, where we're really starting to get into these like concerning territories with what that could mean from a long-term standpoint.
Yeah. Pippa, do you have anything you want to add in terms of kind of symptoms and severity?
I don't think so. I think I'm probably not the best person to ask. And, quite a lot of what I hear and see just anecdotally are pretty similar things. I think there are some very obvious signs, and actually that those are the first to come to the fore. And it might be once you dive a bit deeper that you start to pick up on other things that are concerning, especially in the long term. So as Renee said before, it's about looking more holistically at this problem as a huge big picture and being able to put the pieces of the puzzle together yourself. And sometimes it is you that has to do that, because your healthcare provider won't be as informed as you might be, simply because of the time you have to understand, to research, to talk to others. So it's really important to take some ownership yourself of these issues, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's concerning to hear how much of an impact, this can have on kind of long-term health. And it's great that I guess these things are being spoken about now, so that things can be, or action can be taken at a sooner stage. Okay, and now if we turn our attention to listener questions, some of them are quite similar, so I might just ask one where that was the case. In terms of, if we start off with regular cycles, what biomarkers can be monitored during HA recovery?
I think so one thing I'd say is not to measure them too often, because it doesn't change quite as quickly as people think it does, and I think it can get quite stressful for the individual. But generally speaking, yeah, we will be looking at your more like the reproductive hormone, things like your LH, your FSH, estradiol, prolactin, testosterone, and these all give us some indicator of what's on. But it's really important that you do get that full hormonal. There's no point just doing 2 or getting just 1, because it doesn't need that bigger picture. But on top of that, I would also generally be probably also looking at things like thyroid function tests, because they again also give us quite a lot of indication of what is going on, low energy availability to just general metabolic health. So I think the problem that often occurs is that the range of numbers for these markers is quite large, and obviously they change as you move throughout your menstrual cycles. Follicular phase, they may be lower, in your ovulatory phase, or luteal phase, they change again. So often the problem that we have when medical practitioners are maybe not that invested in this process is that they'll look at the numbers and go, they're normal. So if someone's is flatlined, it's much easier, because you can go, okay, there's a real problem here. But when someone's got some numbers, and they're like mediocre numbers, this is where they then get told, oh, your hormones are normal. And I'll always say to the individual, but you need to push back, because how can your hormones be normal if you're not having a menstrual cycle? So it's a difficult one, but I think it's to understand that it's not everybody, in GPs, not everybody's going to be able to read those markers and actually truly understand what's going on for you. And again, they're all indicative of slightly different things. So, we have a low estrogen, that's telling us something. If you have a low luteinizing hormone, that's telling us something. And I don't everybody knows and understands that you have actually worked in the field and understand that.
Yeah. Okay. And so next up, we've also got, what can an athlete recover their period or recover from RED-S without taking a break from the sport?
Yeah, I think there's a couple questions around this idea. And if I could kind of summarize my thoughts, my first thought always goes to like, why are you asking this? And are you not committed to recovery enough to potentially take a step back if you need to? I think that there's a scarcity mindset there. And so I hate to be the devil on your shoulder, but it's like, why? Maybe you do. But I also, on the flip side, often encourage athletes that, in fact, they should come forward with some of these concerns, because a lot of people hide their symptoms because of a fear of being held out of sport. And that's not something that might be the case for them. And so if you can really recover from an energy intake standpoint and start to cover those gaps and improve your energy availability status, taking time away from the sport might not be necessary. And it could look like a reduced training volume or a reduction in training intensity. It doesn't always need to be so cut and dry of, oh, no sport or no training. And you'd always rather take a step back. I know it's hard to also consider, but the kind of the third facet of this is if the injury risk is imminent because low energy availability is present, you're going to have to take time off potentially because of that. And so there's kind of like these prongs to me, or like these series of questions that I would ask them back. But I do think the encouraging piece is no, you might not have to, because there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that you can manipulate. And I think Rainey spoke to this very nicely earlier, is like, which part do you address first? And that's not going to be the same for everyone. So I guess those are my general thoughts on these like questions around training in REDS.
Yeah, no, definitely really interesting to hear. And then we've also got a few questions around RED-S and how it can present differently, and whether it should be potentially treated differently in women in different phases in terms of premenopausal, perimenopausal, or menopausal women, and also whether using medication to increase BMD in women is a safe way forwards.
I think you need a whole nother podcast for that question.
There's quite a lot.
I was gonna say, I think the whole conversation between perimenopause and RED-S is, I don't think we can answer that in 5 minutes. I'm going to be pretty brutally honest. It's a complicated scenario again, but it is, I think, and again, similar in terms of medication for your own density, it's a possibility, but every case is so different. And I think it is, you do case by case. It's not a generalized, everybody who's got low bone density should be on HRT or should be on, some sort of medication. I think it's very, it's very individual.
We talked earlier too about the idea that GPs will prescribe oral contraceptive pills, which we do know is not only not helpful, can mask REDS, it may also have some detriment to it. So on a more positive side of things, there has been promising research to suggest that transdermal 17-beta estradiol with cyclic progesterone, which is not a form of birth control, can be helpful as like more treating it more of a band-aid while you are recovering from REDS, and maybe trying to fill in those nutritional gaps could be helpful for bone health. It's not the end all be all, but that would be something to consider if bone health is a concern.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that'll be really useful for people in that position to potentially have a look at. And then we've also got some around in terms of if you're in a cycle of stress fractures, will you be able to get back to consistently training again?
I'm always in the camp that of course you can, if you're willing to kind of make those sacrifices, or what might be seemingly sacrifices in the moment. It's often maybe mismanaged return to run or return to training, where I see that like injury cycle persist along with the underlying, nutritional gaps that might need to be covered. But yeah, I certainly think that's possible to come out of.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to hear. And in terms of people recovering from REDS, is it possible for them to still improve in terms of their performance, or continue to compete and train at the level and volume they have been doing? Or is it always going to be needed to take some kind of step back or experience some sort of dip?
I think just as Melissa said earlier, it's about asking the question of why, what is your motivation for trying to perform better whilst recovering from this condition? I don't think there's anything to say that you can't recover and then perhaps return to a high volume of training or a competitive level of your sport. But if you can turn those behaviours and mindsets around, especially, that's the key for me, I think.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I guess finally, because we're a bit short on time, we'll probably hopefully have another episode at some point, or at some stage go through some of the remaining questions and a little bit more information on some areas. But we had a few questions in terms of a specific paper that suggested that RED-S may not exist, by Jeckendrup et al. Or Do you have any thoughts around that? Maybe Melissa, this is one for you.
Yeah, I think that this is really interesting. I've been asked a lot about this paper, and I try to be kind of careful when I summarize my thoughts. But generally speaking, I think the paper does point out some legitimate concerns from a research standpoint about limitations to our current approaches to research. I think that those were pretty well stated in the paper, but also previous to this. I don't think any REDS researcher would really put up a fight about some of those things that we've called attention to. But this is what happens. We have to remember REDS was proposed only 10 years ago. So if we're thinking about how research progresses, like, we do want to move forward and we want to cover those gaps in the literature, but we start with a lot of cross-sectional work. And now I do agree, we've done that foundational work to suggest that we need to move forward and improve our scientific rigor. But it's a little bit dismissive of athlete experiences. I kind of ideally hope that we are all on the same team, that we want to improve athletes' health and well-being and performance, but REDS is a clinical condition and it's backed by research. But as Rainey mentioned, like, there's things that clinicians see that we as researchers don't quite have the ability to keep pace with. And so we are a couple steps behind in that way. And so I hope that it doesn't take away from the betterment of athlete health and performance. And I don't necessarily think it matters like which angle you take. That happens a lot in research. And so as I'm looking at the physiological implications, my peers looking more at the psychological underpinnings. And I think that's what we need to improve the landscape of REDS research. And I don't think, you read the first line of the paper and they conclude that, we can't prove that it exists nor doesn't. And so to me, it kind of just feels like a little bit of a wash, and that we need to continue to keep working on some of these problems for the betterment of athletes and the support staff around them. There's a lot more questions to ask, and I don't think that having more questions than answers means that we should just make it so that it doesn't exist, that type of thing.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And well, that's all we've got time for today. But hopefully there'll be another opportunity to follow up at some stage with some further information. I know all the questions weren't answered, but I think a lot of them were to some extent in the conversation earlier. So thank you so much to all of you for coming on today. It's been incredible to have so many people with such a diverse range of high-level experience within the area and expertise. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
No, thank you. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, be sure to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This really helps to get the content out there. And I want to make this podcast the best possible for you. So go follow Fitter, Faster, Happier on Instagram. That's Fitter, Faster, Happier to leave your questions, comments, and feedback, and for updates and guest requests. All the best for the week ahead, guys. Run happy, live happy, be happy.